Okay, there we go. So, good evening. I'm Randy Kearns. I'm your instructor for Healthcare Management 3030. And this week we want to go over a few more things about research as it relates to our assignment for last week, this week, next week, and actually the next several weeks. And that's annotated bibliographies. I also want to talk about two other pieces. Number one, how does the annotated bibliography roll up into what your ultimate aim is, and that's developing a coherent research project. I have a couple of people waiting. Let me let them in. And then the second piece is to be sure and talk about also our key topic for this week, and that includes research ethics. Part of the challenge that we have with research is there have been times in our past, whether it's in the United States or it's in other countries, but there have been times that researchers have not always been ethical in the things that they did, and whether their aim was pure or certainly had I don't know, at some point, some logical intent. Their methods certainly compromised who the subjects were, the people were that they were conducting their experiments on, and in some cases left people either injured, harmed, or in some cases withheld treatment that they knew would have provided a better quality of life. All those things are completely unacceptable, and all of those things are certainly unacceptable today. And so that's why part of our research process today does include something called an institutional review board. And again, sometimes people feel like, it's like getting a what would be considered a life-saving drug approved. To be able to get to the point where, let's talk about the COVID-19 vaccine as an example, to get to the point where that drug or that medication is approved for use, even being granted emergency use authorization. If you'll recall, Johnson & Johnson began their studies, and so the most recent of the vaccines was the J&J Janssen vaccine. That was just granted EUA authorization. Well, they started their clinical trials within a couple of months of the onset of the pandemic. And although things worked much faster than ever before, a part of that was built on the fact that a great deal of research has already gone into how to create vaccines. And so most of the methodology was already there. It was really about identifying specifically the genomic structure of this particular virus, and then looking for known solutions that we had to defeat a virus. And so each Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, working with Janssen, created vaccines that have all been granted emergency use authorization. But to be able to get to that point required a great deal of research. Each of them had at least 40,000 people participate in their clinical trials. Each step along the way included consent. A part of consent includes informed consent. A part of informed consent is to be sure that people understand that there are pros and cons of taking an experimental drug. And so my whole point to this is J&J turned over their materials to the Food and Drug Administration several weeks ago to request emergency use authorization. And even at the height of the pandemic, when 4,000 people and in some cases 5,000 people were dying each day, it still was, the concern was we don't want to make it any more dangerous by releasing a drug that may have some side effects or may not be as effective as we believe it to be. And so as certainly as quickly as you want the vaccines to roll out, they're going to roll out, but inevitably they're not going to roll out as fast as if we had stripped all of those safeguards away. But understand those safeguards are there because of some of the things that you'll read about this week. That's a part of our discussion board this week. And that's to understand the fact that there have been times that we treated certain members of the public as either less than human, or researchers did not divulge all of the information they should have, or a cure came about, and when the cure came about, they continued to conduct the study rather than treating the people who had the disease. All of those things are well beyond anything that's acceptable in the world of research today. And so that's why our focus this week includes research ethics. You'll see a quiz about this, I think in 2 weeks, either next week or in 2 weeks. But the topics in terms of research ethics will continue to come up because they're very important in the things that we do and the things that we need to be sure that we're cognizant of as we conduct our research. So that's kind of it in a broad scale. Let's look specifically into the details of both the assignments for last week and the assignments for this coming week. More than half of you did exactly what the assignment said. You found 3 peer-reviewed sources. You wrote at least 250 words as it relates to each source. Your own impression, your own analysis of what you read in the article, and you put all of those into one document and you uploaded it, and the similarity score was less than 35%. So all of those things came together for a little bit better than half of you. For the other half that it didn't, and for all of you, let's just be sure that we understand. Again, the assignment is each annotated bibliography should be from a peer-reviewed article, some type of an academic journal. And again, the best place to find those, you can start with PubMed or Google Scholar. I had someone email me earlier today that he had had some trouble with getting someone to share their information on ResearchGate. Just the best way I can describe ResearchGate is it's somewhat of a social media for nerds. I don't have another way to put that other than it's a way that researchers connect with each other around the world. In some cases, they're very quick to respond and happy to share their research with you. In other cases, they'll get around to it, and it may be next week or next month or whenever. If you're waiting on somebody and it's somebody on ResearchGate, move on and look for other sources. You can always come back to those sources because we're going to have the same assignment for the next several weeks. 3 sources, complete the annotated bibliography. Just remember, at the end of the 5-week cycle, you will have collected 15 peer-reviewed sources. You will need all 15 to write your paper. So if for whatever reason you didn't get the assignment turned in, just understand that you're still going to need to go back and do the 3 from last week, because you're going to need those as you start putting together your paper. And I felt like the thing I needed to show you tonight was really the first thing that we're going to write once we finish the annotated bibliographies, and that's actually something called, it's chapter 2 of your paper. So your paper has 5 parts to it, and I think that I've got that on, yeah. So All academic papers, at least written in the traditional research standard, includes these 5 key sections: an introduction and background, a literature review, a method section, a results, and a conclusion. Well, the literature review is really our way of combining and compiling all of what's in our 15 sources in our annotated bibliography. So as we, again, each week, as you continue to build your assignment each week for these annotated bibliographies, that really comes together to, you'll wind up reorganizing that in what becomes your literature review. And so that's why I say I can't stress enough the importance of getting it right. I did some small deductions. If you were under your word count, again, the minimum is 250 words per annotated bibliography. That's a reasonable word count to be able to at least express the basics of what's in the article. And so that's what the expectation is. If you do 3 of those, 3 times 250 is 750. So if you've got less than 750 words, you haven't used the minimum word count to be able to express what's in the articles. So small deduction for that. Second piece is you can't just find the article and cut and paste parts of it into your annotated bibliography. All of your writing needs to reflect your thoughts, your words. What did you read that the author wrote that impressed you? It's one thing to include a phrase of 5 words or a phrase of 3 words, but if you've cut and pasted entire sentences, you're going to wind up with a high similarity score. And just I did some small deductions this time. Just understand, if you submit an assignment and you've got a high similarity score, particularly as this goes on, I'm going to have higher deductions for high similarity scores. So if you see that, send me an email and ask me to reject it, then take it back and rewrite it. I would rather you rewrite it in your words. That's what writing is all about. It needs to be in your words. I had somebody tell me one time that research was about telling me what somebody else had to say. If I want to know what somebody else has to say, I'll read what they said. I want to read what you think about their work and their work and their work. And the whole point to research is you get a chance to read what other people have done and pull all of these pieces together and build a narrative of what you think about all of this. And for me to hear what you think about all of this means I need to read your words and what you've written about all of this. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Are there any questions at this point? If not, I'm going to change screens that I'm sharing. And so let's see, let me share this screen. And so again, just remember there are 5 sections to all academic papers, or generally speaking, there are 5 sections to all academic papers. And certainly in our research, we will have all 5 sections. The pieces that we're going to do over the last week and the next 4 weeks includes developing our annotated bibliographies, and in the end, we will turn those into our literature review. And that's why I felt like tonight the most important thing I could do is kind of give you an idea of what the endpoint looks like for being able to put together your literature review, because your literature review really reflects these 15 articles that you pull together in your annotated bibliography. And I will encourage you, if you decide later on at some point in your life you want to pursue a master's degree, you need these research skills to be able to do that. What about the real world? There are times that you have to do research in the real world. It may not be quite as regimented as what we're doing, but if it is, you at least have the process, and you've at least been exposed to the process of what are things that you need to be able to do if you do wind up in a situation of where you're going to need to do more complete and detailed research. So let's talk about research and writing a literature review. As I said, all 15, by the time we're at week 5, or the 5 weeks of doing annotated bibliographies, at that point you will have 15 peer-reviewed sources, and those 15 peer-reviewed sources will be the basis for your literature review. And in essence, what you'll wind up doing is you'll wind up resorting or reorganizing your annotated bibliographies into what becomes your literature review. And a lot of what you've already written will wind up being things that it's your words, so you can cut and paste your words into your literature review. So with that, let's get started with the presentation for tonight. Again, 5 sections. This is the focus of the literature review. It is important to think about how not everyone's had exposure to this, not everyone has a background in this. And I do understand that in some courses, or certainly some classes, you've not had someone use Turnitin as an example. Just I use Turnitin. I also use another piece of software called Grammarly to help me sort out. I use Grammarly when I'm writing my own papers for publication. And the reason I do that is sometimes, first of all, I'm old, I'm a little scattered at times. My brain doesn't always click the way it once did. And there are times that I repeat myself. And so what I wind up doing is I use Grammarly to help remind me, I've already published that, or I've already said that in another paper. I need to think about a different way to say that. It's okay for you to use tools like that to help remind you that either you've written that before or somebody else has written that before. But just be careful. I've also had people say, well, I can cut and paste this to help me find my words. I would tell you to be careful doing that, because whatever you end up with needs to be substantially different so that it doesn't trigger. Some people use Turnitin in a lot more punitive fashion than I do. I try to use it as a way to remind you, somebody else has already said that. Those words have already been used and used in that fashion. Think about another way to say that. And so I understand that not everyone's had experience reading literature and understanding where's the best place to find some of the scientific information. It's also important to think about how you ask questions. What are the questions that you ask? How do you look for the answers that you need? And where do you find the information? Because again, that is rather empowering. It's also important to think in terms of, what does the literature show us? How do we connect the article that you found to the topic that you've presented and the topic that you want to ultimately research? As I told you last week when you did your question presentation, I do think as you continue to conduct your research, you'll start to, and I'll work with you to narrow your question. Most all of you were close to where you needed to be last week. You were close enough that nobody was off in left field. I will tell you, in just about every case, what you'll end up with is a more focused, more narrow question by the end of the time that we get to where we're writing the paper itself than you are right now. But that's okay. Again, a part of reading the literature and understanding what's already been published is to help you get to that point. It is important to think about scholarly articles. Where do you find scholarly articles? Again, typically they're academic journals. Academic journals assure that the paper has gone through a peer review process. In some cases, it's gone through multiple peer review processes. Some are ranked much higher than others. In fact, at the University of New Orleans, if I submit an article for publication to some journals, it has greater favor. It has more importance to the university than if I'm submitting articles to other journals. And so they remind us to favor certain journals over others. It's important to also understand the difference between peer review and a trade journal. As an example, there's a company out of California that publishes a magazine for paramedics across the United States, and they publish about 55,000 copies every month. And given the fact that there are not a lot of actual magazines still being published, I found that somewhat unusual, actually, but they're the largest publisher, and there are times that they ask me to write articles for them, and they have an editorial review board, but they're expecting me to recruit co-authors that are the experts in this work. Last year, they published 5 of our papers over 12 months. And so they're not going to critically tear apart our work and question it. They're going to expect that we're the experts. And so that's okay. Just understand that's the view for a trade journal. A trade journal is not peer reviewed. Peer reviewed is, I can choose as many experts as I want, and I typically do to help write a paper, but that's also to help me defend it later on as again, peers start reading through some of my work and give me critical feedback that suggests there's some other things I need to do to make this paper work, or multiple fixes or multiple changes that I need before that peer will review my paper favorably. And then there are some journals that are really difficult to get published in. 2 in particular, the Journal of the American Medical Association, also known as JAMA, and the other one's the New England Journal of Medicine. In both of those cases, I've never been published in either one. But JAMA, as an example, I submitted a couple of articles to JAMA, and the first time or two I submitted an article, I'd go through all of the lengthy process to submit it. That morning, well, that afternoon, I had a rejection email politely suggesting that I take my article somewhere else. And that's okay. It still got published, but it got published in a lesser journal. And that's to remind me that I'm not the top tier researcher. Well, fast forward a couple of years, I did at least get to the point where I had articles that were being read, reviewed, and then mid-tier journals, they were being referred to for publication. And so, that's a part of paying your dues in the research world. But just understand that's where research is at. That's where your high quality peer-reviewed articles are located. And you can only find them in places like, again, PubMed and Google Scholar. I will say I shared a link today in the discussion board on Moodle for our class that shows you how to search for a peer-reviewed article through the University of New Orleans library system. I don't search for a lot of literature there, so I can't tell you how successful you'll be, but university libraries are typically very robust and allow you at least a better than reasonable degree of success. It's also important to understand what literature is not in the context of peer-reviewed. Common knowledge, such as Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a good place to find sources and to find again, general context of information, but we don't treat Wikipedia as the absolute end sentence for anything. Again, it's a great collection of information and it's a good starting point. But if you want to get into the scientific research that's there, Wikipedia is not that place. Google is a great place to, again, just get a start for what you're looking for. And then there are also websites that are out there, somewhat satirical, some intended to be comical. The Babylon Bee, I actually had somebody quote that one time. I had to look it up, but once I did, okay, so it's somewhat funny, I guess, depending on your sense of humor. But regardless, it is not a source for anything that we're doing in academic literature. And so, again, all of those, it's okay to use things like Wikipedia, it's okay to use things like Google to help you find more of what you're looking for. But ultimately, when you find an article that is peer-reviewed, that's a part of your academic search, that's not going to be something you find on Google or Wikipedia. So again, when we talk about the literature, let's talk just a little bit about the how. In terms of what a literature review is, it's really about putting these pieces together. Sorry, I've got somebody trying to get in the class, but it's about trying to put these pieces together. A part of your literature review. So again, just a reminder, once you finish all 15 of your annotated bibliographies, you're going to have to sort them into groups and package them in the largest part of your paper, which will be your literature review. And so most of the work for the literature review, at the time you need to write it, you've already written it doing these annotated bibliographies. So I don't want you to feel like, great, I get to that and I've got to start over and write, what really amounts to more than half of my paper in one assignment. That's not true. In fact, as long as you do a good job with your 15 annotated bibliographies, chances are one of the easiest parts of your work will be to then take those 15, sort them so that they line up together, and then repackage them as your literature review. And so again, the importance of getting your annotated bibliographies correct cannot be overstated, because ultimately all of those pieces will fit together in your paper to create your literature review. Again, other types of literature. So it could be a journal article. Some types of journal articles are, so if we think back to our research class, we talked about primary sources of information and secondary sources of information. A lot of what's done, and certainly what your research will be secondary sources of information. We're not going to design something that's specific to your research that requires you to collect new, unique data for the project. In fact, we'll look for data that's already there, and the data that's already there, again, because it's collected for a completely different reason, we'll use it for your paper, we'll use it for our needs, and that's called secondary sources of information or secondary research. But again, if we look at the types of literature that's there, is it smaller or is it larger? The larger it is, the more it's likely to be either a part of an article, or again, at some point it could be a part of your thesis. If you're working on your master's degree, your large research project that's due at the end of your master's degree is your research thesis. If you're working on a doctoral degree, the research that's due at the end of the doctoral degree is your dissertation. My master's thesis was about 75 pages, and my doctoral dissertation was about 180 pages. If that gives you a little bit of the difference. My master's thesis I think I had about 35 sources for my master's thesis. My doctoral dissertation, I had about 200 sources for my dissertation. So again, if that gives you an idea of the difference in the depth and detail of the writing, again, if you wind up going further in your academic career. Again, the function of the literature review is to really take, to help your reader understand the problem. You're going to develop a certain structure to it. And another part of that is to also demonstrate your knowledge of the field. Well, in doing so, what you've done, so when I talk about you're reading these articles and telling me what you understand from the article in your words, that's how you demonstrate your knowledge of the field. So again, later on, when you take these annotated bibliographies and string them together in what really becomes this about half of your final paper, that's where the literature review comes from. It comes from all of these annotated bibliographies. And again, another part of this is to help talk about where further research may need to be conducted, whether that's by you or somebody else reading your paper. Other pieces of this is, again, the structure of the problem. It does help demonstrate your knowledge of the field, what you understood, what your perspective is. And again, this pointing the way to future resources or future research. A part of that understanding is what someone gets out of reading your paper, hopefully. Again, the annotated bibliography starts with finding a peer-reviewed article. So this is one particular article that I wrote, published in 2014, and it includes a lot of secondary data. It's a retrospective analysis of a disaster that occurred at an industrial plant in Raleigh, North Carolina. And it gives kind of an analysis of all of the things that happen, including the healthcare response and how that unfolded that day. A point to that is to, again, if you're looking for peer-reviewed information, well, this is an excellent example of a peer-reviewed article. We went through multiple levels of peer review before we got this published, but this was published in what's considered a highly classified journal, a highly weighted journal. Other pieces about digging into the literature, you really start out with the major groundbreaking works that are out there, and then you look for smaller studies that exist that really rely on the major works. And so the whole point to doing a literature review is to help you understand what's already been published, and then to specifically look for something that's new. What's missing of what's been published that you can contribute as new information? How can you take what other people have done and synthesize it into in some ways something that's new? And a part of that is, again, what we're going to try and tease out through the repetitive annotated bibliography assignments and roll that up into our lit review. So again, when we dig into the literature, a part of it is to put it all together. Where are these major works located? What type of related works are out there? Where do you find them? And then what type of new information may be available? And all of this kind of comes together again as your lit review. For your work, we're really focusing just on 15 peer-reviewed articles. I'm not trying to make this too big and too onerous and too difficult, but I do want you to be able to understand the process by the time you finish this assignment. Another part of this is to, again, start with a topic. You wind up with some writing and revision. You've got some research and collecting information, and you work with articles. I've got one piece in here that we're not going to do in this class. Um, right now, I want you to learn how to build references in your paper manually. Now, there is a piece, there's actually several pieces of software that's out there called RefWorks and EndNote that does some of those things for you automatically. Right now, you need to get accustomed to how do you write a citation, how do you keep it in order, how do you include your works cited at the end of your paper. I think if you understand how to do that manually, later on, if you do wind up needing to do this in the academic world, either working on a master's or working on a doctorate, at that point, I would steer you to one of these software programs. Right now, I will tell you that there's actually a somewhat crude version of it. Of a citation manager in Word. If you've found it, then you're welcome to use it. If you haven't found it, you want to look for it, it's there. If you don't want to worry about it, that's okay. I wouldn't worry about it. But again, the more sophisticated software like RefWorks or EndNote, please don't go that far into this. Right now, your main focus is getting good articles and understanding the process rather than trying to understand how to use a new piece of software. In terms of the topic, a part of this includes, as I've said before, your initial topic won't be your final topic. Chances are, whatever you started out with 2 weeks ago, as you read more about it and as you read more about some of the other related articles, what you'll start to see is it'll start to develop a focus for you, and you'll start to build a certain excitement about something that you've become interested in as you read through this. But as I've mentioned before, and I've said plenty of times, and I'll remind you again, please only focus on research and focus on a topic that's interesting to you. Otherwise, this is painful. And research should not be painful. It should be fun, but it's only fun if it's something that's interesting. It's something that you want to learn more about. Anyway, you'll refine it as you go. Sometimes there's not enough research in the particular area that you want to look at. I talked about in class teaching a police officer in Wilmington, North Carolina. She was a captain in the police department, and she wanted to write about other police departments that were using Narcan, a drug that reverses the effect of an opioid overdose. And she found pretty quickly there weren't a lot of, particularly in 2012, there weren't a lot of articles about that in the scientific literature. And so, since there was too little information that was available, it was very difficult for her to write about it early on, until we started looking at what are other things that she could write about that tied back to what she was interested in. She was interested in writing about police officers being able to use Narcan to reverse the effects of a narcotic overdose. But just because there's not a lot of articles about that in publication, are there articles about paramedics using Narcan? Well, if there are, then that may tell us a little bit more about the use of Narcan. Are there articles about police officers using a defibrillator or some other type of medical device that's not really typical to what a police officer does? We could look at the training of how often they use their equipment and how quickly they were able to respond, and correlate that to police officers also using Narcan. We could also look at training and retention. What are unusual things that police officers are trained to do, and how frequently do they need to do it to retain the training and retention of the skill? And so the point is, if you have found a topic that you really like, but you can't find, there's too little literature that's there, there's not a lot of literature that's out there for it, there's other pieces of your question that we can research that we can tie back into your question. And so again, it gets back to, we may have to dig a little more, but if you'll let me know if you're having trouble, I can help you narrow in on what you're trying to find, or maybe broaden out and look for other things that's related that we can bring into your paper. Again, the topic and then research and collecting information. Really, once you select your topic, the next big step is annotated bibliographies, because the annotated bibliographies, as we start to collect research, as we start to collect these papers, it'll help shape our question, it'll help shape our interest, and it'll help point us into a more specific place of where we want to take our research. And so again, we go with topic, research and collecting information, and working with articles. And from the working with articles, again, we may refine our topic, using the citation manager to stay organized. I don't want to teach that in this class because, again, I feel like you've got enough to wrestle with to just primarily focus on your topic, your annotated bibliographies, and down the road, we're going to roll those annotated bibliographies into your literature review. Again, and tying that back to our topic, our general question that you proposed last week. What else do we want to talk about here this week? Sources for your literature review, we've identified that. In terms of checking the major disciplinary database, again, the places I would tell you to look in the healthcare world, PubMed is certainly a big one. Google Scholar is important. ResearchGate can help you find papers that are otherwise difficult to find. And then the University of New Orleans Library has a general search engine that allows you to select peer-reviewed only, and you can pull up papers that way. But all of those are options for you. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about here? The citation database, again, that's the one that I've not pointed out is Web of Science. Web of Science is out there, but it can be difficult to reach and a little bit difficult to manage. The two primary ones I would point you to are PubMed and Google Scholar. And then ResearchGate can also help you find papers that may otherwise be difficult to find. You know, questions that do come up, how do you know you have the right stuff? It really gets back to, as you're reading the paper, you do kind of have that aha moment. That's what I'm thinking, or that's what I'm interested in. Or as you're reading it and that's really not what you're interested in, that may help change the direction of your topic or your question. And all of this in terms of how do you know when you're done, chances are there's more papers and more research out there than you're going to max out at 15. 15 is actually a pretty small number. That student I told you about in Wilmington, when I taught this class before at another university, we did 25 citations. I felt like that was a little bit much for what we're trying to accomplish in this particular course, and that's why I toned it back to 15. But even at 15, depending on what your topic is, we may still need to find something that's related but not specifically identical to or exactly like what your question is.
Is 15 like a max, or if we find like another article or two after we do our bibliographies, we can add them in?
I'm sorry, let me turn that volume up. Ask that question again.
Is 15, I know that we're submitting like 15 annotated bibliographies overall, but like down the line, if we find like one or two more articles that we end up using, can we add those into like our bibliography at the end?
You can add them into your literature review, and you can include those in different aspects of the discussion of the paper. And I would also be sure and cite them. You won't need to turn them in as a separate assignment for an annotated bibliography. But you also make a good point that I think I've said, but let me repeat, and that is, even though the assignment will max out at 15, I do expect you'll have other sources that you will cite that may not be peer-reviewed sources. As an example, if there's a headline in the New York Times that is exactly what your question is all about, it's okay to cite that, and it's okay to talk about that during your paper, but you won't, number one, it's not a peer-reviewed source, so it won't count as one of your 15 peer-reviewed sources. And number two, you won't need to discuss it in the literature review, but you can bring in other sources into your paper. The one that I'm most accustomed to seeing is if you have any population statistics. In most cases, you'll cite a web page developed by the Census Bureau, and that's certainly not peer-reviewed data, but that's a very good place to collect that information and to use that to cite in your paper. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. And again, in terms of how will you know what's important, it does start with being sure you have good sources, and your sources really need to start with good peer-reviewed articles. And it is important to be sure the article came from a journal that is peer-reviewed. And the reason I say that is, again, just as I mentioned earlier, I have published, and I publish every year in some type of a peer-reviewed journal, at least one article. I've got about 81 publications. But I'll also publish several things each year in trade journals. The trade journals aren't peer-reviewed. Again, if you cited something that I wrote in a trade journal, that's just like citing the New York Times or like citing the Census Bureau. It's interesting. It may be important factual information, but it doesn't fit into that 15 that we're looking for the annotated bibliographies and the peer-reviewed sources. So I will expect that you'll have more than 15, but the main focus right now is 3 at a time of the peer-reviewed journal type articles. And again, because each question is different, there's really no set answer in terms of when do you know that you've collected all of what you need to know. A part of that is up to you, and a part of it's driven by the topic. Again, some topics are easier to find information about. Some topics are a lot more difficult to find information about. If there's a particular article that you want to find that you're struggling to find, I still have access through the University of North Carolina School of Medicine library. If we can't find it through UNO, I could probably find it through UNC. So send me a note and let me see what we can do. And again, for us, we're going to stop at 15 annotated bibliographies, and then there will be other related citations. That's just for our work, and I felt like 15 was a good place for us to stop. After 15, you at least have an understanding of the process without having to do 25 or 50 or something that you may see at some point in your life. I will tell you, if you do wind up doing that at some point in your life, I would purchase either EndNote or RefWorks. I've used EndNote for the last 20 years, and it's worth its weight in gold, but it's one more thing you need to learn. And right now, I would not encourage you to go out and make that purchase just so you can learn that just for this class, or spend that type of money just for this class. Right now, I would encourage you to just write the citation based on the way the APA literature shows you to write it, and get used to how to write it and construct it yourself. Later on, you can speed things up with one of the citation managers. And yeah, right now the key is just learn the process. Later on, you may want one of these. When I talk about synthetically, again, the synthesis of how do we pull things together, I do compare this to, so last week we wrote 3, this week we're writing 3, next week we'll write 3, over 5 weeks we'll have 15. What I would encourage you to do is after that 15 are done, you're going to wind up compiling sections or groups of articles in a way that helps synthesize from the start of the first one to the last of the 15th one. How do you connect those 15 together? Are there 3 that particularly talk about one aspect of your problem, and 4 more that talk about a different aspect of your problem? All of that will vary depending on what your question is and depending on the angle that you take in writing your paper. So I do compare this to putting my receipts together to do my taxes. You know, I've got some things related to my home, I've got some things related to a business, I've got some things related to whatever deductions I'm going to get, and so I've got multiple piles. And that's what you're going to wind up with if each of your 15 annotated bibliographies, trying to get them together in different topics, because as you if you look back on that sample paper I gave you last week, she wrote a very good literature review. I think that would give you a good guide in how you can put together your literature review as well. And if you like, by the time we get to that part of the assignment, that'll be several weeks out, I can post a couple of other literature reviews for you as well, again, just so you can see how somebody else wrote it. But all of this falls at the end of doing these 5 weeks worth of annotated bibliographies. But I can't tell you enough how important it is to get all 15 of these done, because you will need them as a part of your overall research. Let's see. So the synthesis model, the main point about this is, again, looking at how themes, either introducing a concept or how they're relevant to each other, or maybe how they compare to one another. There's something called the stringing model and something called the synthesis model. With the stringing model, we really talk about one piece stringing it together to the next, to the next, to the next. With the synthesis part, we're looking at grouping sections together. Either of these are fine. Our main part is to remember at some point your literature review folds together as, again, giving your reader some background into how you understood what you read and how you wrote about what you read. It is important to write as you go. Don't wait until you're finished to start searching for the literature. You need to read the literature and then write as you go. I would encourage you to do a little bit each day. If you wait until Sunday morning to try and find your articles and write your literature or write your annotated bibliography, chances are by the end of the day, all you're doing is trying to get an assignment done. And because all of these articles are really going to impact your final paper and assignments that you do along the way, it's important for you to take your time and take some steps along the way to get it done in that fashion. Yeah, so let's kind of wrap up at this point. The main point that I would make this week is, again, to get back to, please spend a little bit of time reading at least one of the articles and doing your analysis under our ethics and research, which is our main topic this week. Again, you'll see a little bit more about this later on in the class. You'll see literature review. You'll see the same presentation later on in the class. I did feel like it was important for us to go over it tonight, just so that you can see what's at the finish line when you finish those 15 annotated bibliographies. Sometimes, not knowing enough about what the assignment leads into, when you know more about it, it makes it easier to understand the basis behind the assignment. Also, just as a reminder, we will have class next week, seated same place that we were in last week, 122 Kirschman Hall. And we'll do some other things, again, similar to this, to help you understand how these pieces fit together. But your main assignment this week is to, again, read one of those articles as it relates to ethics and research, and to post your question and do a couple of follow-ups to classmates. And then 3 more annotated bibliographies is your assignment. As a reminder, each annotated bibliography should be at least 250 and generally not more than 350 words. And several of you did turn in 1,200 words, and that's okay. Again, whatever word count you feel like you need to describe what you found in the paper, just don't cut yourself short. If the entire citation, and you and I both know the word count of some of the citations may be 30, 40, 50 words. Well, if it's 50 words and your entire submission is 150 words, that means what you described about your paper was only about 100 words. You really can't clearly talk about what was in the paper with that. So again, the minimum is 250 for all 3. The minimum is 750. Let's keep that in mind, and that needs to be kind of our aim. There were a couple of people that had some trouble with how, remember, these are double spaced, 1-inch margins. Be sure and look at the APA format of what I referenced, and be sure to make yours look like that. APA style is what we need in this assignment. At that, I don't have anything else to add tonight. Are there any questions?
I mean, I just wanted to talk about my subject and what you thought about it, but I mean, we can leave that for after class. I just want you to know that now.
Well, so as far as your subject goes, the main point that I would make to you and to all of you, the presentations that were done last week, each of the topics that were presented, including yours, I think that's a completely workable topic. Certainly, if it's something you're interested in, I think that's ideal anyway. I will tell you, as you start to read more papers, it may help you narrow your focus of your question. But I don't want to tell you too much about what I think, because I'm not the one doing the research. You're the one doing the research. And so what I would encourage you to do is, as you're reading the research related to your question, I think that will help you narrow the scope of your question. Ultimately, about 90% of you will have a little bit more of a narrow focus by the time you get to the end of this. But again, I don't want to tell you how to think about it. I'd rather you, as you read and understand and get a sense of helping you develop and refine your question, I think that'll help you. And as always, though, if you still feel like you're struggling, or if you feel like you're uncertain about something, just send me an email. And if nothing else, if you want to chat, we'll set up a time to talk about it too. Okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Who else out there?
I just have, well, I could save this question for after class too. I was just gonna see if we had like any feedback on my annotated bibliography, but I was gonna email you about that.
Okay. You should be able to look and turn it in. I did post feedback on every assignment today for the annotated bibliography assignments. I'm not sure if I've got all of the questions caught up. I'll go back and look in those tonight, and if I haven't, I'll get those updated by in the morning.
Okay.
Yep. Are there other questions? Okay. Well, again, folks, just a reminder, we'll be in class next Tuesday night. And I will, although we have moved to level 3, and I can't remember exactly what the university is calling it, or anyway, the point is this: I still work for the Department of Health, the State Department of Public Health during the daytime. And as much as things are better, and things are much better than they've been probably in the last 10 or 11 months, there's still COVID out there. And so I can't encourage you enough to continue to do the things that keep you safe until you can be vaccinated. And when you have an opportunity to be vaccinated, whatever vaccine is the first one that's available to you is the best one that's available to you. I have been vaccinated. My wife's been vaccinated. My son's been vaccinated. All of us, because of different roles that we play. But, you know, and things are much better than they have been. But right now, our best success continues to be with good public health measures. So we'll still continue to physically distance and wear a mask and do the things that are necessary to keep us safe. We are in far better shape than we've been, but it's still there and it's still a threat. And so I want you to feel comfortable, but at the same time, I want you to be guarded as well. So anyway, I don't have anything else. If you don't have any other questions for tonight, I appreciate your time. Let me stop sharing and let me end. You all have a good night. I'll see you next Tuesday.